All right, Fascia Friday, episode 2, and this week we're going to look at training the four properties of fascia, which we know to be viscosity, elasticity, plasticity, and remodeling. This is going to be a bit of a two-parter, so I got a good amount of information in this. And before we get to looking at the how to train the exact properties of fascia, I wanted to just kind of look at generally the premise of the fascial system in regards to training. And the number one question that I normally get is, well, what differentiates training the fascial system versus the more conventional musculoskeletal based approach? And my answer is very simply nothing other than just modifying or manipulating the training parameters, the variables, the way in which we're performing certain movements, and how we periodically move throughout the training calendar. But in a sense, anything that you do, training related or otherwise, is going to implicate both the fascial and the musculoskeletal systems. It's just really a matter of perception and or what you are trying to emphasize. But with that, some of the things that are distinct about the fascial system, or at least distinctly different than the musculoskeletal system, is first and foremost, when we think about fascia, we need to think about or understand the concepts of biotensegrity. Biotensegrity is a term that was introduced back in the 60s by a gentleman named Dr. Stephen Levin, and really this is just tensegrity principles applied to human biology. So tensegrity structures have been around for literally centuries, and we see it all the time in modern architecture and in day-to-day life. But again, as it applies here, this is really just suggesting that it is a principle based on a system of isolated components under compression inside of a network of continuous tension. So this object right here is an example of a simple tensegrity structure, and we see both struts and cables here that are supporting the the cables are supporting the struts by creating a tensioning network, and in a sense keeping the struts to be free floating or without touching one another for stability. In addition to that, fascia is made up of essentially just collagen and water, and it responds with non-Newtonian fluid properties. So the easiest way to think about this is to think about a bowl of cornstarch, as Thomas Myers has demonstrated. If you slowly insert your hand into a bowl of cornstarch, the cornstarch will give and allow for your hand to kind of penetrate into the liquid. However, if you go and try to punch a bowl of cornstarch, it's not going to have any give at all. This is the same way that the fascial system responds, and really all that means for us is that we have to be cognizant of the fact that different speeds of movement or different rates of application of force are going to change the way the fascial system responds to this. Importantly, the fascial system is an interconnected system. So when we say that everything in the body is connected, that is quite literally the case. We have a single piece of connective tissue that envelops everything from the cranium all the way down to the toes and everything in between. This system is highly enriched in proprioceptive bodies, and a study recently has suggested that there's about 6 to 10 times more proprioceptive bodies in fascial tissue when relatively compared to muscle tissue, and that's a really marquee thing or trait about the fascial system. This kind of ties into what are also known as motor engrams, which are essentially just sensory or motor organs that are found in the fascial tissue as well, which encode familiar or repetitive movement. So we've all heard the terms muscle memory, and we know that, for all intents and purposes, that is not a true thing. The fascial memory, however, may be a little bit more truthful in that we are able to kind of encode what we do with repetitiveness and then become more seamless with those actions. When we look at the training principles, the general principles here are very simple. We just want to think multiplanar movement. We want to work in variable speeds. We want to have, rhythmic or dynamic coordinated type of actions. I think a lot of this comes back to just being, functional, primitive, or contralateral based, in which we want to try to replicate the way in which the body naturally moves. I do think that there is a benefit to using a more of a variety of stimulus or applications of load. Accommodating stimulus or perturbative stimulus is also another one that is very keen for the fascial system. And then we also have soft tissue or self-myofascial release techniques that are also privy for fascial health. When we look at the factors of training, I've kind of alluded to a couple of these, but the first one is the rate of loading, so the rate at which force is being applied. In addition to that, the speed of movement, so the speed at which the athlete is performing the movement, are both going to be considerable factors. In addition to that, we have the direction of force, in which we know now that we want to permeate outside of just the sagittal frontal plane boxes and really try to look for more of those obscure kind of blended cardinal planes. And then the contraction type and the type of stimulus that are applied are also going to be considerable factors for how the fascial system will respond. Lastly, the presence of hydration is going to be a big factor, and this is because, as I mentioned, it is a collagenous water-based system, so if we are dehydrated, the fascial tissue will not glide and will not have the same properties or ability as it normally would or should. All in all, collectively speaking, it's very important to understand that emphasizing the fascial system does not negate other biological systems. Just because we're looking at things from the lens of the fascial system does not mean that the musculoskeletal system does not exist. It again is just a matter of perspective and emphasis. The key to movement is integration, and being that the fascial system is an interconnected system from head to toe, your gut should tell you that the fascial system is going to be a marquee part of movement integration. We mentioned it, but omnidirectional multi-tempo movements are really going to be the underpinning to elucidating the fascial system in training. And really, this is just a system of tension and compression. So we just want to try to orchestrate and balance the system based on what we see with our athletes and how they are, or how it's going to be required of them to move in sport. So now if we look quickly to the four properties themselves, and I mentioned viscosity, elasticity, plasticity, and remodeling are the four marquee properties of fascia. So starting up here in the top left, our viscous properties, or our ability for tissues to glide without the presence of friction, are going to be really dependent on rhythmic movements, submaximal dynamic actions, and just general fluidity of movement. So for this, I'm thinking about general dynamic movements, things like hops, low-level skips, lunging and crawling patterns with reaching and rotations. And then, we can also look at soft tissue modalities such as flossing or cupping. And these are things that are going to help improve decrease the presence of viscosity within the tissues, but in essence, allowing the tissues to glide better. This can simply be assessed or observed by saying, can they move without disruption or discomfort? If things look arduous or strenuous that shouldn't, that to me is an indicator that they are struggling with viscous properties. As for the elastic properties, this is a little bit more conventional speed, sprint, plyometric training, but our elastic properties are the ability to stretch and store mechanical energy. And we do know now that the fascial system is a major player in this stretch shortening cycle or series elastic component, in which we are utilizing the stretch reflex, the most powerful stimulus in the human body, to create an overspeed effect or an exhibition of producing mechanical energy. So for this, we're thinking about more dynamic stretching. We're thinking about reactive plyometrics, things like med ball slams and rebound jumps, bounding, and then more aggressive hops, and even to include submaximal sprinting. But for this one, you really want to just boil it down to, are they springy and elastic enough for their sport? Do they look like they are too soft, or are they too stiff? Can they react, and are they reflexive? The common term now is twitchy, but these are your elastic properties. As for plasticity, and we talked quite a bit about plasticity in the first episode, but this is our ability for the fascial tissue to reform and reshape. So for this, we are just looking very simply at high intensity loading, high force effort, high force plyometrics, full effort sprinting, long time under tension, but we want to expose the body to high force or high effort modalities that, again, challenge this ability to reform and not distort or denigrate under load, and then being able to reshape back after the fact. This is, again, another simple assessment where we just want to simply look, can they move well under high load and accommodate high force exposures? If not, they need to improve their plastic properties. And finally, for remodeling, this is very simply, we are what we repeatedly do. So we look to really the KPIs for this are everything. Everything becomes a factor at some point or another. But generally speaking, training, general health, wellness, your sleep hygiene, your sleep patterns, stress management, your emotional management, and then your hydration and even nutritional factors are all going to be considerable in this. But what I wanted to finish this out with is taking a look at the adaptation times down here. And just a broad stroke here, but neural and motor adaptations occur very rapidly. These are actually the first adaptations to occur when you get into a training cycle. So we're thinking about 1 to 2 weeks here for short-term adaptations on the neurological end. Aerobic is going to be a little bit more, but we're looking at about 2 weeks to about a month. And then for the muscular system, we're looking at about 6 to 8 weeks. Now for the fascial system, we're looking at 1 to 2 years. This is obviously a much longer adaptation window. So for this, I want to leave you with the point of the importance of consistency and doing things with consistent repetition in order to drive true change. You have to be patient and you have to be consistent across time in order for any of these adaptations to truly undertake.